Good evening and welcome to Martin Luther King Jr., The Theology and Rhetoric of Nonviolent Social Change, or The Rhetoric and Theology of Nonviolent Social Change. This is week number 8. It's March 2nd, 2022, and we're going to talk about the women of the civil rights movement tonight. And so I'd like to begin this evening's talk by giving some background, I guess you could say, on women in the civil rights movement and some framework, basically, that would be a theoretical framework for understanding the importance of talking about women in the movement and why maybe they were neglected or misunderstood or not central to our understanding of early civil rights movement. Now, of course, there's some big names you're going to see in tonight's lecture that were at the forefront, but there was also a problematic aspect to this. And so I'm going to give out an incredibly beginner level understanding of the theory of gender and sexism and feminism, just briefly to get us started on this talk tonight. So sexism, like racism, is seen by many as a sociological problem and as a function of a system of male domination, or even it's sometimes called patriarchy. But sexism, and all of these definitions are straight out of your basic encyclopedia and dictionary type resources here. So sexism is the prejudice or discrimination against women on the basis of their sex or gender. Sexism is linked to beliefs around the fundamental nature of women and men and the roles they should play in society. Sexist assumptions about women and men, which manifest themselves as gender stereotypes, rank one gender as superior to another. Such hierarchical thinking can be conscious and hostile, or it can be unconscious, manifesting itself as unconscious bias. Sexism can touch everyone, but women are particularly affected. Recently, quite a bit of debate, and I would say that in our society, especially here in Tennessee and in the Bible Belt, and in a conservative, a state where the politics are leaning conservative at the level of state government, that this idea of gender being socially constructed and gender roles being negotiated and mediated by society is controversial. There is, and since this is a theology and rhetoric course, it's very important to say that there's a religious basis to what's called the gender binary, or sometimes called gender complementarianism. And these folks will tell you that men and women are biologically made different by God, and that there's a sort of an essence to each biological sex that is incontrovertible and divinely ordained. And it's not recognizing for gender variety within men and within women, much less as far as being inclusive and understanding of transgender issues. Now, I've studied gender studies, and I've also my whole life been an advocate for kind of the rainbow flag of LGBTQ, et cetera, inclusion. Coretta King, before her passing, spoke eloquently for gay rights and believed that Dr. King, had he lived to see that the major civil rights movement of your generation, that he would have been supportive of civil rights for LGBT persons. Bayard Rustin, a major component of the civil rights movement, himself was homosexual. So there is some evidence that that there would have been an inclusive aspect had Dr. King lived, and definitely the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement led to the feminist movement, which also led to sometimes called the women's liberation movement, which also led to the gay rights or gay liberation movement. And so they're all very much connected. And the civil rights movement preceding these movements, there's a very important aspect of what I'm going to say about our work today that plays into that. So the sociological framework from an academic side will say that these things are embedded in systems like education, like business, like religious institutions, and that it's not simply a matter of what you might call male chauvinism, or a man making a sexist joke, or a man making an inappropriate gesture or advance. Though domestic violence is real, survivors are real, like stories of people who have been abused is real, and also men and boys are abused as well, oftentimes by other men and boys. So sexual violence is real. It's all connected. Today, a lot of social justice advocates talk about intersectionalism, which basically is saying that all of these things are interwoven and interconnecting, and there's not sort of just you can't pull one out from the other without talking about it. So the belief of feminism is the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. There was a huge upsurge in feminism in the early part of the 20th century. It was connected to the right to vote for women. It was connected to the temperance movement. A lot of the people that advocated against alcohol abuse and for sobriety and even for prohibition were women's Christian temperance groups, because they saw men getting drunk and then they saw men being like really abusive. So in the 19th and early 20th century, the right for women to vote, the abolition of slavery, and combating rampant alcohol abuse were all united causes of the early feminist movement. And the feminist movement in the 60s advocated for birth control, the right for women to get divorced, the right for women to have sex outside of marriage, or to control their own bodies, reproductive freedom, the right to have a terminate a pregnancy, which was guaranteed in the early 70s. So there was a huge, women's movement that happens right after the civil rights movement. And there's a lot of overlapping and interconnecting values here. And one of the things that we've learned studying this with the long view is that women from the civil rights movement got radicalized around rights for African Americans. And then they saw the inequality within the civil rights movement. They saw that women were being discriminated against by men in the movement. So feminism is a range of social movements and ideologies that claim to define and establish the political, economic, personal, and social equality of the sexes. Feminism incorporates the position that societies prioritize the male point of view and that women are treated unjustly within those societies. And so just as racism historically is a white problem, as we've come to understand it in this class, sexism is a male problem. Now, you're going to hear stuff about men's rights and dad's rights, and women are, feminism has a bad rap in certain segments of our society. I'm not going to address that too much tonight, but of course you understand that these topics are nuanced and negotiable and debatable. It became clear in the women's liberation movement that white women were organizing differently than Black women. And so womanism emerged as an African-American women's movement to talk more specifically about the experiences of Black women. And also this really toes in with theology. So women's liberation movements, feminist movements, and womanist movements, Black and white movements, straight women and LGBT women are starting to really become awakened. They called what they were doing consciousness raising. And from that struggle and that movement, they started talking about religion. They started talking about images of God and the masculinity of images of God. And they started talking about having inclusive language. It was very much leading towards even an understanding of goddess as well as God, a feminine aspect of the divine. And it all gets spurred on. And so women who were in college, for example, in the 50s and 60s, then get awakened in the civil rights movement, then end up joining the feminist movement or the anti-war movement. And one of the things that they become aware of is sexism within those male-dominated movements. And Southern Christian Leadership Conference, one of the leaders, we're going to talk about her in a little while, was a male-led movement. And women were involved as well. And there was lots of women on the forefront of civil rights. And I'm going to kind of take us through a hall of fame, if you will, of that. And then we're going to take a deeper look at just a couple of those figures. But by the 70s, womanism and feminism was leading women outside of the mainstream of Christianity. And some of them were getting ordained in Christian churches, but then some of them were going and getting PhDs and master's degrees in theology. And they were writing books about the history of patriarchy and how it's even possible that in antiquity or in pre-civilized societies, there was more of a mother-centered and a woman-centered society. And there's even theories of kind of a time before time when women ran the world. And there's a lot of artwork being made around these themes of gender liberation. And there was also science fiction books being written, speculating about women's power and women's liberation. There was something called the Christian youth movements, the World Christian Youth Movement, the University Christian Movement. It was connected up with a little bit with the YMCA, but there was all these kind of campus movements. There was actually a tie-in here with the Wesley Foundation, which is a Methodist student organization on 9th Street, just to the east of our campus, Tennessee Tech. And there was a whole group at the Wesley Foundation in the 60s that were a part of this sort of cultural awakening of the civil rights movement, the peace movement, and the women's movement. They were also involved in kind of hippie and flower child stuff and music and having very experimental worship services. Well, they were part of this larger university Christian movement, and it really merged in with the new left. So people were coming out of church and then getting involved in the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the anti-war movement. And then it got involved in kind of the whole explosion of counterculture in the late 60s and early 70s. And there's two Tennessee Tech alumni that I wrote a biography of called Calvin and Nelia Kimbrough. The name of my manuscript is Banjo and Bread, and it outlines the role that the church played in the kind of the 60s awakening. And Nelia has a whole statement about how she was able to stay Christian, but while she was negotiating her newfound feminism that emerges out of that movement. Not enough can be said about Coretta Scott King as the major female figure of this class because of her relationship with Martin, because of the fact that she raised their children while he was on the road, because of the fact that he was not faithful to her, and that put a strain on their relationship, that she was an activist before she met Martin, that she was committed to the causes of peace and civil rights before she was with Martin. She didn't join up with the movement, to kind of be with Martin. She, in fact, was already an activist, and her activism was one of the reasons that she was attracted to Dr. King. And so they had a true love relationship. It was an absolutely genuine, loving relationship, despite some of the hardships that I've already described. And she was an activist on her own terms. And then she inherited the mantle of that. She established the King Center, and one of their adult children now is running the King Center. And so his lineage and his legacy lives on through Coretta and through the King children. But she was absolutely a diehard and committed social justice activist and advocate. And she became one who was called on many occasions to speak on behalf of their family after Martin's assassination in 1968. There's a new TV show out. I can't remember what network it is on, but that's all about Mamie Till, or Mamie Till Mobley. Mamie Till was an American educator and activist, and she was the mother of Emmett Till, who was murdered in Mississippi at the age of 14 in 1955 because he was accused of whistling at a white woman at a grocery store. And he was hunted down by white terrorists, and he was murdered, and his body was abandoned in water, in like a river or a creek. And then it was found, and she insisted on having an open casket funeral for Emmett Till in Chicago, which was a galvanizing moment in the civil rights movement. I mean, he was like the George Floyd or the Trayvon Martin or the Ahmaud Arbery or the Elijah McClain or the Breonna Taylor of his time. And it was a very, very important moment in the mid-50s in the civil rights movement. And the courage of Mamie Till is known worldwide. If you ever go to deep into the deep South in Mississippi, there's a couple of different Emmett Till museums. I visited one of them. It was incredibly moving and heartrending. And going deep into the old cotton belt of and delta of Mississippi, there's still a lot of poverty. And there's still a lot of African-American descendants of slaves who struggle. And there's also a very cruel prison there called Parchman Farm, Mississippi State Penitentiary. And some of the remnants of the evil, unjust system of slavery still exist in Mississippi. And Emmett had been on a trip to visit family from Chicago, and she wasn't even sure she wanted him to go before his murder. And she was very active and worked with Black civil rights activists to amplify the tragedy of her son's loss. And so she resurrected Emmett through her witness for civil rights. And so you can't really talk about this time period or this movement without knowing who Mamie Till is and knowing who Emmett Till was. A lot of people have been talking lately about Ruby Bridges. There's been a lot of discussion about a book about Ruby Bridges and whether or not children should be reading it in school. She was born in 1954, and she, as a little girl, helped integrate the William Frantz Elementary School in Louisiana. And it was in a wild desegregation crisis. I mean, and during these times, I mean, the racist opposition to desegregation would harass even little children, like Ruby Bridges. And there's a very famous painting made of this story by the famous artist Norman Rockwell called "The Problem We All Live With," a little black girl trying to walk to school. So she grew up to be a civil rights activist her entire life. So that is Ruby Bridges, and I'm taking us through now, class, through kind of like a hall of fame of civil rights women, some of whom I know a lot more about than others, but who should all be at least in the back of your mind as we move forward to this class. I'm not going to talk a lot today about Rosa Parks because we already discussed Rosa Parks, and she is the matron of the movement. But the important thing to know about Rosa Parks is that she was a trained rank and file civil rights activist. She was active in the civil rights movement. She made a decision to do the action. That was a kind of a direct action, her not giving up her seat. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't accidental. She wasn't just some random woman who just got caught up in this thing. She was a part of the movement already, and she continued to be a part of the movement. And like Dr. King, she got training here in Tennessee, in Monteagle, Tennessee, in Grundy County at the Highlander Folk School. I'll make a brief reference to that Highlander Folk School in passing a little bit later in this portion of the lecture. I can't remember if I told you on an earlier call, forgive me if I did, but when I was in my early 20s, I worked at a health food store in Detroit, and it was a very small cooperatively owned store. It was owned by the customers, food co-op, and most of our clients were African-American, though we had a lot of kind of hippie bohemian types, which is what I was at the time. I guess I still am. And one day, and there was a lot of like big kind of big athletic looking men that would, shop there, and sometimes men with huge dreadlocks. And sometimes we'd even see people from the Nation of Islam, which we talked about last week. And one day, and it was very crowded, it was near closing time, all these big dudes like all moved out of the way. It was like the parting of the Red Sea, and nobody gave cuts in Detroit. Detroit was not a place where you could take cuts in line, and they were all like stepped aside. And like in the presence of royalty, they moved aside. Oh, you go ahead. No, ma'am, you go forward. And you've seen somebody, give cuts to an old woman. But anyway, this tiny little old woman shows up at the cash register. I'm working the cash register, and this is before scanning. You had to type everything on the keyboard of the cash register. And she had this little paper bag with some herb tea in it, and that was it. She was just buying a little bag of herb tea. And so I said, "Are you a co-op member?" And she said, "Yes." I already kind of knew what was going on, but I wasn't sure. I was shaking and crying. And she pulls out this little beat up paper co-op membership card. And I got to sell a little bag of herb tea to Miss Rosa Parks. And that was definitely the highlight of that day, and a big highlight of that part of my time in Detroit was selling tea to Rosa Parks. But she is definitely a mother of the civil rights movement. This is Diane Nash, who we've already talked about quite extensively in the class, and so I'm not going to go into too much more detail about her, but she was a huge part of the Nashville movement, and later married James Bevel, and she's still an activist. She's very elderly now, and there's a young African-American civil rights activist from Nashville, Tennessee called Justin Jones, who actually was a part of a big action during the summer of 2020 in Nashville. And he spoke here at Tennessee Tech once before. And he's dear friends with Diane Nash, and they talk all the time. And so he, as part of his activism, has gone out and found all the saints and elders of the movement, including Diane Nash. And there she is marching. I believe that's C.T. Vivian with her on the left. So that might have been during the Birmingham struggle. Okay, the woman on the left is former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and the woman on the right is Dorothy Height. Dorothy Height was born in 1912, and she was a civil rights and women's activist, and she focused on supporting African American women, helping them through unemployment and literacy and voter awareness. And she is credited as somebody who really wanted to talk about connecting the inequality that women faced with the inequality faced by African Americans. And she was a president for 40 years of an organization called the National Council of Negro Women. So this intersectionality, this is Dorothy Height. So the intersectionality is, if you're African American, that's one level you have to face of racial injustice. And then if you're female, you also have to deal with gender justice issues. And so a Black woman has that vantage point of experiencing discrimination, both as a woman and as a Black person. Is there a question?
Kind of. There's actually been coined a name for the intersection of racism and sexism. It's called misogynoir.
And I had not heard that. Can you spell it and drop it in the chat for us?
Yeah, absolutely.
I really appreciate that. I'm going to add that to my vocabulary, and I really, really, really appreciate you sharing that with us. So that was Dorothy Height. Here's another Dorothy. This is Dorothy Cotton. She was born in 1930 and was active in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference as their educational director. And so when we think about SCLC, we often hear about, Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson, Ralph Abernathy, the male ministerial leaders, and we don't hear about the females that were really, really active, even in SCLC. And one of the major feature points of my lecture tonight the videos we're going to look at later, the people I'm going to kind of like elevate and highlight, is one of the women that worked in SCLC. I'm really thrilled to have that added to my vocabulary, and thank you very much for pointing that out to us. So that's Dorothy Cotton. This is Marion Wright Edelman. Marion Wright Edelman was part of the Children's Defense Fund. She was seen testifying before Congress about poverty among children in the Deep South, and she got Bobby Kennedy, before he was assassinated, to come on a tour of the Deep South to visit with families and children, and they were very, very active in the war on poverty. I believe she's still alive. She's pictured here at Alex Haley's property here in Tennessee, where they have a big civil rights gathering. I think before COVID, they were having it every year. I'm not sure if they were going to have one this year. I don't think they had it the last 2 years. I'd like to go. I've heard it's amazing, this Alex Haley civil rights reunion that is held here in Tennessee. But through Marion Wright Edelman's organization, it might have been written by her. She sent out a prayer for all the children of the world right after the war started in Ukraine last week. And so she lifted up the children of Ukraine with all other children in the world who are victims of war, violence, and oppression. It's absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous prayer that she made. I'll try to remember to either read it to you or share it with you all at the end of the class. But she's visited Tennessee Tech. She's amazing in every way. Marion Wright Edelman, a true genius of the movement. Marion Wright Edelman was born in 1939 on June 6th. She's exactly a year older than my dad. She's the founder and president emeritus of the Children's Defense Fund. She went to Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, and is just really a great and incredible humanitarian leader. She was very involved in the Poor People's Campaign and is really focused on economic issues related to the welfare of children, such as support for adoption, foster care, child care, protecting children who are differently abled, homeless, abused, or neglected. She once said, "If you don't like the way the world is, you have an obligation to change it. Just do it one step at a time." Out of everybody on this talk tonight, she is a real shero of mine, Marion Wright Edelman. This is Septima Clark. Septima Poinsett Clark was born in 1898, way back in the 19th century. And she was very active in the voting rights movement, and was sometimes been called Queen Mother or Grandmother of the Civil Rights Movement in the United States, or the mother of the movement. And she was somebody that maybe wasn't gained as much recognition as some of the other people in the movement. She was involved in the NAACP, the the Highlander Folk School here in Tennessee, and what are called citizenship schools. And so she was really a kind of a grassroots educator. This is Septima Poinsett Clark. And I wish I had more to say about her, but I'll have to read a book or something. So next time, if they let me teach this class again, I'll have more to say about her. This is Ruby Sales. Ruby Sales was a little bit younger than some of these folks. Was born in Jemison, Alabama in 1948. She's an activist, a scholar, and a public theologian. She was called a legendary civil rights activist by PBS. She graduated from the Tuskegee Institute, also attended Manhattanville College and Princeton University, and she has the Master of Divinity from the Episcopal Divinity School in 1998. So she's been really involved in kind of contemporary liberation theology. She was involved in SNCC in Alabama. And this is another, she's in kind of an unsung hero, and has been involved in many different programs, including the Spirit House Project, which is a nonprofit organization in an inner city. And she's a connection that to the Black Lives Matter movement, between the old civil rights movement and the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement. Ruby Sales. I'm not sure 100% how to say her name, but it's Zernona Clayton. It's spelled Xernona, Zernona Clayton. I remember her because I'm pretty sure she's the person in the Eyes on the Prize of Spring '68, giving a birthday present to Martin Luther King Jr. in the SCLC office on his very last birthday. I'm pretty sure she's the same person. She was born in 1930. She went on to be a media, and she's still with us. She's 91. She went on to become a media and broadcasting celebrity. And she, one of her things was that she witnessed for the love of all humanity to a member of the Ku Klux Klan, who then later denounced and renounced the KKK. She's been honored by the NAACP and the city of Atlanta for her lifelong work. A lot of these people, you can go on YouTube and find videos about them, or documentaries, or interviews with them. Zernona Clayton. This is a white woman making an appearance in this lecture, because this is Zilphia Horton. She moved as a very young woman to Monteagle, to the Highlander Folk School, fell in love with its founder, Miles Horton. They were married like 2 weeks after they met. And she died young in 1956. She was only 46 years old, but she was a musician, community organizer, educator, activist, and folklorist. And she was very involved in learning and teaching some of the great songs of the movement: We Shall Overcome, We Shall Not Be Moved, This Little Light of Mine, and helping turn these old hymns and kind of folk songs into the protest anthems of the civil rights movement. There's a new book out about her called The Singing Army. And the Highlander Folk School disbanded in the early 60s and moved to East Tennessee and reopened as the Highlander Center. There's a graduate from Tennessee Tech called Elizabeth Wright, who lives in Knoxville and works at the Highlander Center. And many people I've known through my work in theology and activism are involved in the Highlander Center. So her work continues through them. And the Highlander Center is a major force in the South, always based in the South, for civil rights and for economic justice and the empowerment of all people. And they really were big for their cultural education and for their camps. And so they would be involved in singing, but also in acting and plays and workshops. And they would go and support workers on the picket line. They were very involved in the union movement here in the South, which is incredibly important, and because there's been a very strong anti-labor, anti-worker sentiment here in the South for many, many decades. So that's Zilphia Horton. Just in passing, a few of these major music figures, and I'll get back to them next week, actually, because we are going to get completely in to the music scene next week on next week's class. And I'll be introducing your creative final, of which one of the things you could do is write a song or make a playlist. But this is Bernice Johnson Regan of Sweet Honey in the Rock. She wrote the song Ella's Song, which is about one of the major people that we're going to be talking about tonight. So keep put a tab on Bernice Johnson Regan, and we will get back to her next week. But I got introduced when I was working in that same grocery store where I met Rosa Parks. I got introduced to this music. They were playing it all the time on the boombox in my store, and I kind of fell in love with their music. Some of it was a cappella, a lot of it was a cappella based, it was very moving to me. And they actually would come to Detroit and do work for us. And she got involved before Sweet Honey in the Rock was formed with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Freedom Singers. And their singing at protests was a way they raised money for the movement, but it was also like it was a galvanizing factor for the movement. And she collaborated with a very famous white folk singer called Pete Seeger on an album that I have, and they were doing movement music pretty much just all the time. Bernice Johnson Regan. And I think I referenced some of these folks already, but these are very, very famous people. Mahalia Jackson was actually a close, dear friend of Dr. King's on the right, and her song Precious Lord, Take My Hand was sung at his memorial service in 1968. Nina Simone was very militant. She wrote an amazing song called Mississippi Goddamn that was performed in the Deep South during the Civil Rights Movement. And then she wrote an amazing eulogy to Dr. King called The King of Love is Dead. If you've never heard her sing, I please after class tonight or as soon as you are possibly able, get on wherever you get your music and listen to some Nina Simone. But these women were very close and adjacent to the movement, as was Odetta on the right and Joan Baez. And Joan Baez was a very close associate of Dr. King's, and really a connection to kind of the anti-war movement, the hippie scene, the folk music scene. Joan Baez is also very, very good friends with Bob Dylan. So the cultural, and then of course on the male side there was the Staples and Harry Belafonte and many more celebrities as well were very supportive. But the women in the folk music movement were also very much in the civil rights movement as well. I showed you these pictures actually when we talked about the March on Washington. And then kind of emerging after the death of King and very much adjacent to the Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement. And this, Mason, this kind of goes in with some of what we were talking about, the tensions between the mainstream nonviolent civil rights movement that was religiously based and led by King and the more politically militant. But she is a giant. She was born in 1944. She's still with us. She's extremely active to this day. Angela Davis. She's a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She's involved in left-wing politics, Marxism and communism and socialism. She identifies the intersectionality of class feminism, race, and the United States prison system. And she's a leading advocate for what today is maybe the next wave of our civil rights movement, which is the abolition of the prison industrial complex and completely rethinking community safety and perhaps even the abolition of the police. We'll talk about that topic of where the movement is going at one of our last classes of the semester, and I'll try to link the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement and all of its issues to the historic civil rights movement. She was incredibly controversial in the 70s. When she was facing some legal problems, a lot of churches raised money for her, and a lot of people got really mad. My former denomination, the Presbyterian Church, was one that raised money for Angela Davis back in the 70s, and that caused people in the rank and file out in the in the heartland and the hinterland and here in the South to be very upset with my church for giving money to Angela Davis. But she is absolutely a giant in the movement, and as far as also being a visually compelling human being. There was a lot of the women in that time period who started wearing their hair natural, wearing the afro. It was a big deal in the early 70s, the empowerment that was going on. And Angela Davis is a a sister and a saint to everybody who cares about these causes. She's really, truly incredible. So this brings us to our main event for tonight. I'm going to feature two women activists. This is Ella Baker. They actually wrote a song, Sweet Honey, called Ella's Song. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes, until the killing of Black boys, Black mothers' sons is the important as the killing of white boys, white mothers' sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. She passed away in 1986. She was born in 1903. She was born and passed on the same day. That's actually considered to be a sign of sainthood right there. Turns out she has the same birthday as my sweet and wonderful wife, December the 13th. She is considered to be a giant. She worked with everybody from W.E.B. Du Bois and Thurgood Marshall to A. Philip Randolph to MLK to Stokely Carmichael to Bob Moses and to SNCC. And so she was very, very involved in SCLC for a while. And I think she was disillusioned a little bit with SCLC, and then she moved over to SNCC. And here's the thing about Ella Baker. She does not believe in hierarchy or charismatic leaders or big male egos. She believes that the movement is truly best that is decentralized, that is grassroots, that's radical democracy, and the ability of the oppressed to understand their own words and to advocate for themselves. So she is a true radical democratic activist of the people, of movement from the bottom up. And we're going to listen to a speech by her later, but early in her career, she from the 30s to the 50s, she was in the NAACP, and she was a circuit rider. They made her a circuit speaker, and she would go on speaking junkets into small communities all over the South to bring the message of the NAACP. And then she moved over from the NAACP to SCLC for just a few years, and she kind of ran the infrastructure of SCLC in its earliest days. And I think she got kind of just a little bit disillusioned with famous ministers like Martin Luther King Jr. and became very, very involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I want you to listen very, very closely to the speech we're going to listen to her, because she is a true visionary of her own regard about the importance of activism from the bottom up, where everybody is equal. And she literally was a tireless activist. Her activism preceded Dr. King's activism, and she was in it for the long haul. And she was known to say, don't let Martin Luther King Jr. tell you what to do. She was known to say, the movement made Martin, and the Martin didn't make the movement. I mean, she was very much interested in an independent grassroots movement that was inclusive of everybody. And she mentored people like Bernice Johnson Reagan and Stokely Carmichael, Julian Bond, and Diane Nash. She was involved in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was an alternative to the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party, which is a big part of the other person that we're going to feature today, who's also equally charismatic and amazing and deeply grassroots. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Fannie Lou Hamer. From October 1917 to March of 1977 were her dates. She was a voting rights advocate, a women's rights advocate, a community organizer, a true leader of the civil rights movement. She was amazing in what she did by trying to seat the Black Democrats at the Democratic National Convention, competing for the seats with the racist white Democrats. She was very involved in Mississippi's Freedom Summer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was the co-founder of the National Women's Political Caucus. And she started a farm in Mississippi, like a people's co-op farm in the 70s, but her health was in decline. She passed away, and she's married at the site of this former farm. She's been harassed, assaulted, threatened, extorted, harassed by racists, harassed by police. She is fierce. And we're going to watch a whole documentary just about Fannie Lou Hamer that's brand new, that just dropped. And you all, your minds are going to be blown. This woman she's amazing. And I love the name of where she's from. She's from Sunflower County, Mississippi. And she descends from sharecroppers and people who worked the land. She was a devoutly religious person and believed that the biblical exhortations for the liberation of the people, and she believed in a God of liberation. So she really embodies everything about this, what this class is about, which is about the theology and rhetoric of change, because she had the spirit. This woman had the spirit, and she had a way to speak that would inspire people. And you're going to be incredibly inspired by the documentary about Fannie Lou Hamer that we're going to watch here in just a few moments from now. So that's going to conclude the brief lecture portion of my presentation for this evening. I'm going to pause the recording and leave a moment for comments or questions, and then we'll get into our films for this evening. We'll first listen to a beautiful speech by Ella Baker, and then we'll watch a documentary, a short documentary on the great Fannie Lou Hamer. So the women of the civil rights movement in a short kind of whirlwind tour with high emphasis on Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, who we're going to learn about more in just a moment.